welcome everybody. As we've said, the session's being recorded and you will get a copy of the recording, the slides and a transcript via email in the next few days. And as I've also said, there are captions available if these are going to be helpful for you. Actually, we don't have a Q&A window in this Zoom instance, but do please use the chat window if you have any questions or for any general conversation. So we'll catch up with questions at various points during the presentation. My colleague Ryan is also on hand to help with questions. And if there's anything that we don't get round to during the session, then we can round up any questions afterwards by email. So I think we'll see a feedback form when you leave. And again, if you can ask follow-up questions there or suggest future training topics. Yes, so do please ask if anything's unclear or if you've got any problems at all. Maybe message Ryan or speak up if you're having real difficulties or anything. So just a quick word about AbilityNet. We're a UK technology charity providing a range of free and expert paid for products, services and resources. Our vision is a digital world accessible to all. So, you know, that people should be enabled to use technology to access the whole of digital society that we have these days. So our products and services include digital accessibility consultancy, auditing, training, this kind of thing, accessibility accreditation, and also diverse usability testing. So in this session, hopefully you know something already about accessibility. We're going to look at some practical examples, and I'll be using the AbilityNet website and also a few other sites to show you how we look for issues using some free tools. You might want to follow along on your own website or the website of your choice, or possibly have a go afterwards with the recording. And so you will learn how to understand some common accessibility issues and how to identify those to help you get a basic understanding of the accessibility of your website or other web product. We'll look at some simple techniques to identify accessibility problems. So you'll be able to use these without any assistive technology and with no particular knowledge of coding. We'll explore some free tools that can help you with your testing. And we'll understand how to approach scoping for accessibility testing. So scoping being how to decide what you're going to test. So I've got a poll to start with, which I will try and find the controls for. Poll 1, right. So the questions are, no, hang on, sorry, this is poll 3, right. They are in reverse order for some reason, right. Sorry about this. Poll 1, there we go. How confident are you in understanding the accessibility of your website? So the options are not at all confident, somewhat confident, moderately confident, or very confident. Okay, I think we probably got nearly everybody. So let's end the poll and have a look at the results, which are obviously anonymized. So 14% of you have said not at all confident, 49% have said somewhat confident, 30% moderately confident, and 8% of you very confident. Okay, so you're mostly somewhere around the somewhat confident level. So I'd say you've come to the right session. So just to have a think first about what we are testing against. How do we measure what is the level of accessibility of our website? So the main international standard is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which we tend to refer to as WCAG. This is it's currently at level 2.2. We'll also be talking about level 2. Version 2.1. And this is a recommendation created by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, which sits alongside the specifications for things like HTML and CSS. And it is the universally respected standard for creating accessible content. So internationally recognized and generally considered to be the guidelines that you should follow regarding accessibility. So, for example, Apple's human interface guidelines have very similar wording. It has 3 levels. It has like a pyramid. So level A as the absolute base level of accessibility. These are the sort of the most simple things you can do that will benefit the largest number of people. Then there's level AA. If you want to meet level AA, you also need to meet level A. So you can't have the second level of the pyramid without the first. And this is generally regarded as the kind of the level which it's practical for most organisations to meet. So it contains a mix of things which are beneficial to a fairly large number of people, and this is what we generally target. And then further than that is level AAA. And this is, you could perhaps regard this as your stretch goals or best practice guidance. These are things that it's not always practical for everybody to implement in every instance, but it's well worth knowing about them and being able to refer to them. And it's important to document what guidelines you aim to meet. So some organisations have a legal requirement to meet certain versions, for example. So the other thing to say about this is that it consists of 50 success criteria. These are testable pass-fail statements. So I'll just show you an example. So this is version 2.1 of the guidelines. So, for example, the very first guideline is about non-text content. So this is things like images. And it states that all non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. So this is things like alternative text for images. Let's ignore the exceptions. This is a level A success criterion. So this is things like alternative text for images. And we want to make sure that that text alternative serves the same purpose as the image. We can apply this statement to a web page and we can say this web page passes that or it fails it. So you may be familiar with WCAG from the European Union accessibility regulations. I'm not quite sure how I'm sure you have a short version of this, which hopefully somebody will tell me. The European Union Accessibility of Websites and Mobile Applications of Public Sector Bodies Regulations 2020. Our equivalent legislation in the UK is Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations. So this is a European piece of legislation, effectively. It stems from European legislation and is based on a European standard called EN 301549. Effectively, all of these things require the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1, level AA. And so that's effectively the standard that you need to meet. The guidelines are also broken down into 4 principles, which are that content needs to be perceivable, everybody can perceive it, it needs to be operable, it needs to be understandable, and it needs to be robust, which means basically the technology all has to work. So it can be possibly a bit overwhelming if you haven't worked with it before. An approach like these quick checks may be a more helpful place to start in establishing a baseline. So just a quick word about WCAG 2.2. So the W3C recently upgraded the guidelines to 2.2. This isn't going to apply to you directly yet in Ireland, because the European legislation is going to, I think, remain tied to 2.1 until the legislation is actually updated. However, it's worth being ready for 2.2. You may as well start implementing it now because it's going to come at some point. And also there will probably be further European legislation to think about in the form of the European Accessibility Act. So I won't get into huge detail about what's new in 2.2. So we've just gone up to this in the last month or two. And it's got a few extra success criteria. It's relatively minimal. It's not some kind of radical overhaul. If you meet version 2.2, you will also be meeting version 2.1. Yeah, so it's a few extra things about like target size and making sure that people can log in without too much hassle, that kind of thing. And a lot of the new success criteria are more helpful to people with cognitive disabilities, for example. At some point, there will be a version 3, and that's likely to be more of a conceptual shift, possibly some kind of scoring system rather than a pass-fail type thing. Okay, so I've got another poll for you. So as I said, we've got 50 of these WCAG success criteria. Do we need to check every one of them on every page on a website? Let's have a look at the chat. Oh, yeah, thanks very much for that. Yes, I think we also had that link ready to share. Okay, right, poll. So let's try and get the right one this time. So yes, do we need to check every WCAG criterion on every web page on a website? Just inadvertently showing you the answer. So the options are yes, no, and not sure. Yes, do you have a short version name of for the regulations that you use at all? We call ours PS bar in the UK.
I just don't hear again. No, we don't.
Okay.
We have a statutory instrument. We usually call them the EU Web Accessibility Directive when we refer to them.
Yeah, I got it. I had to go in through my browser. It's yes, yeah. I was. Yeah, yes, I have it.
Is everybody muted that should be muted? Okay, right. So I think everybody's voted, and 49% of you have said yes, we need to check every criterion on every page on a website. 22% of you have said no, and 29% of you have said that you're not sure. Okay, sorry, I forgot to share the results. Let you have a look at it. There we go. Okay, so the correct answer is no, you don't. So say you have 100 pages. I mean, that's not necessarily even a massive website, and you have to check 50 success criteria on each page. That's 5,000 checks, you know, that could be more than 150 hours, which is just not really very practical. And then you've also got some content that appears on all pages. So for example, the header and the footer, you've probably got common components, you know, maybe buttons or form fields, types of forms and things. Templates, so maybe you've got a blog. For example, you know, all of your blog articles basically use the same template. So you only really need to test one instance with some representative content on it. But what you do then need to do is to take the learnings from the results and apply them across all of the pages. So what we want to do is pick a representative sample of your pages and make sure that we look at different types of content. So and then there may be things that are out of scope, perhaps, that you're not ready to test, or perhaps they're free third-party products that are managed by somebody else, or there may be various reasons why content may be out of scope. So alongside the WCAG success criterion is the WCAG evaluation methodology. And this defines a 5-step process of how you can go about getting this representative sample. So we want to define the scope and then explore it to identify key pages, functionality, etc. So if we start by defining the scope, this can be challenging if you've got a large website. So how much of this website are we actually going to test at this point in time? Then we go on to explore the website to identify key web pages, identify key components, the most important user journeys, perhaps, different types of functionality or design templates. So for example, you might want to be really clear that particular important journeys are accessible. But then perhaps if you over focus on those, then that might leave other pages really inaccessible. So you've probably got some decision making to do there. So then you want to select a representative sample. So, for example, you might have different platforms that you're using. You know, the back end is something different. The content management system is something different. You want to make sure that you're including representative samples from any of those. Different types of templates are all represented. So one website might actually have multiple domains or multiple platforms within that. And then you would go on to evaluate that sample of web pages and report the findings. So as an example, if we think about, say, a university website, you know, you want to think about, are all areas of this in scope? So this can include, actually, let me bring up an example of the city website, which hopefully is somewhere here. Yeah, so for example, this is the University of London, City University. So it has all these different pages. So for example, it's not just sort of about us and information about courses. You've also got a student hub, a staff hub. There's probably a library page somewhere. You may have all of these different research departments that have different types of platforms. There could be all sorts of things going on here. You know, the library service might be on some completely different platform for learning management systems, all sorts of things. So it's likely to be more manageable to break it down and do it in chunks. You know, you might want to do the basic website first and then some of the other bits and so on. Yeah, if you're going to test the entire website, then everything is in scope. You need to think about things like third-party products, embedded content such as maps, payment forms and discussion boards. If you're paying for things, then you are responsible for making sure that they are accessible, even if you don't necessarily control them. If you're testing a specific area, such as the courseware application, the learning management system, then all parts of that area are likely to be in scope, for example. Yeah, so anyway, you've got a lot to think about. It's a good idea to try and break it down in a sensible way, and then just make sure you include representative content from each of those areas. So how do we go about testing accessibility? So we might divide testing methods into 3 groups. Automated testing tools, manual testing, and site scanners. So automated checkers are often free, and some of them are in your browser developer tools already. There are also paid versions, which may be a bit more advanced or helpful. Or sometimes those are plugins that can be used in development processes or within design programs. Automated checkers can really speed up testing and help you to spot things that you might otherwise have missed. You can test more than you otherwise would be able to. You can test a lot more pages, for example. And today we're concentrating on tools that you can use without having a huge amount of technical knowledge. Manual testing involves carrying out a range of checks using both simple tools such as just using the keyboard, perhaps some more complex tools like assistive technologies, screen readers and things to identify issues. And we can do quite a lot just with the inbuilt accessibility features of browsers and operating systems. It's perhaps a slightly artificial distinction. So even if you're using automated checker, you still have to press the button and interpret the results. Automated checkers are getting more helpful at interpreting results for you. Of course, AI may make them even more helpful. We're already seeing some advances there. Yeah, so you do still need to be able to interpret the results to an extent. Then we also have site scanners. So these are really a further kind of automated testing. These are usually paid for, and they will test every page on your website. So for instance, you could set them to run once a month and pick up any errors that you can then correct. But there is no substitute for the human element of testing. So disabled user testing, so take a bunch of representative users and watch them going through your website, that can really offer you a deeper level of insight into your site's usability and accessibility. So we'll come back to that briefly later, but it's quite a big topic. So, you know, we have a whole webinar covering that. So we're not really covering that in this session. So poll 3, can an automated check identify all WCAG issues? Let me bring up the poll. Okay, so the options are, so the question is, can an automated checker identify all WCAG issues? The options are all of them, most of them, some of them, or only a small number. Okay, I think pretty much everybody's voted now. So let's end this and share the results. So none of you very wisely said that automated testing could identify all issues. 55% of you said most of them, 40% of you said some of them, and 5% of you said only a small number. Thanks very much for voting. Okay, so the correct answer is the gov.uk did a review of automated tools. This is a few years old now, and it may have improved since then, but probably not very much, I shouldn't think. And this found that up to 40% of WCAG issues could be found with automated testers. So they can assist with finding accessibility issues, but yeah, somewhere between 30 and 50%. Yes, this was 2018. But also you need to be able to and as I said, well, to interpret the results, but also to sense check certain things. So for example, an automated checker can check whether a page is titled. You know, does this page actually have a title at all? But it can't tell you whether the page title describes the content of the page or if it's unique, for example. So there is always a caveat. If you do use accessibility checkers, then you need to do additional checks on top. There are a lot of automated tools. Some of them are more user-friendly than others. Some of them may just generate a lot of errors that you find difficult to understand, you know, maybe things about ARIA roles that are slightly baffling to you if this isn't something that you know about. And occasionally they do also pick up false positives. So a common thing might be contrast issues. It doesn't quite read the right bit of the CSS to interpret what's going on with contrast, for example. So in recent years, they've become slightly more user-friendly. We'll talk you through the results a bit more, maybe give you a link to a page where you can read up a bit more. Sometimes you will get multiple issues which report the same problem, or for instance, if you have no alt text for images, that might get reported 20 times, but really it's just one issue. So it can come across as a bit overwhelming sometimes when it's not really. Just occasionally, as I say, it'll compute a slightly wrong result. And sometimes multiple tests are done in order to test for one success criteria. So there's not necessarily a direct correlation between the tests and the success criteria. And just running an automated checker or scanner and saying that your score is 5% better than last month doesn't really do that much other than give you some kind of metric. It's certainly not a guarantee, but it does give you a metric and you may find that helpful. So some common accessibility issues. These are the ones that we most commonly see. Incorrect heading structure or lack of heading structure. So we want the heading structure to create a skeleton for the page. People who use screen readers, for example, and also people who just visually look at a page will use the heading structure to understand what is on the page and what content is there. And it helps them to just sort of quickly get a scan of what's there and whether this is the right page for them, etc. Insufficient color contrast or use of color for meaning. So many people don't have good color vision, or they have poor vision. We need to make sure that elements stand out, text, user interface controls, that kind of thing. Use of color for meaning. So that would be something like a form field just turns red to indicate an error. If you can't perceive that red, that's no good to you. Missing alternative descriptions on images, which we've discussed before. Lack of keyboard access. You need to be able to get through all of the functionality of a website using only the keyboard and no mouse. Missing focus indicators. So we'll look at that later. You need to be able to see where you are on the page. Inaccessible form field error messages. Again, we'll look at this shortly. And videos that don't have any captions, transcripts, or audio description. So these are the most common issues. Which of these can be found with tools? So incorrect heading structure or lack of heading structure, that can be detected automatically. But you can only really tell whether the heading structure is correct and meaningful by scanning it yourself, as in visually scanning it, looking at it, reading it. Insufficient color contrast can be tested automatically, but use of color for meaning can really only be tested for manually. An automated checker can tell you that the alternative description for an image is missing, but it can't tell you anything about the quality of that description. It can't really tell you whether it serves the equivalent purpose. Further to this, lack of keyboard access, that has to be done with manual testing. Also missing focus indicator has to be tested for manually. We can check for form field labels automatically, but we need to make sure that the labels are correct manually by reading them. Also form field error messages, that requires manual testing, and we need to check videos manually also. So these kind of quick checks that we're doing, this is not a complete set of testing criteria for WCAG. This is a way of testing those common accessibility issues. So the benefits of this is that you can complete these checks without extensive accessibility experience and without using assistive technology. There's a bit of a learning curve for using assistive technology. When I say assistive technology, I mean things like screen readers, magnification, the kind of technology that some disabled users may use when they're using your website. But another benefit of these is that they can indicate the likelihood of accessibility issues existing on a website. So say you do a couple of pages and they're horrendous, you pick up loads of errors, then you know you've got some work to do. They can identify areas of accessibility risk. So say you've got an essential service and those pages are coming up badly in your quick checks, then you know that you need to focus on those if you want to avoid legal action, for example. And they can help you to develop an accessibility roadmap before you go through a full audit, to identify priority areas, problem areas, and that kind of thing. Some issues with these quick checks. So as I say, they don't cover all the requirements. They're not going to be as accurate as doing a full audit, and they aren't going to tell you if you are fully compliant with WCAG. The 16 checks that we're looking at are these. Actually, these are just here for reference, really. So we don't need to read through all of these. So the checks don't necessarily fully check the success criteria that they're listed against, but they may check bits of it. They check the most common bits of it. What we've done here is we've just put the relevant success criteria for each of these checks that we're going to do. Okay, so if we start by thinking about scoping, which pages are we going to test? So say you've got a very basic website, a small website, I don't know, you're a plumber or something, and you've just got about us, that kind of thing, and a few basic pages. The absolute minimum would be, if you're using a website with templates, would be something like a landing page, 2 or 3 content pages with some different types of content on, maybe a page containing a form, preferably with different types of fields and some validation, and a multimedia page. So it's good to test a form, preferably a complex one with some input fields, drop downs, checkboxes, radio buttons, that kind of thing. Not so much a login form because that's only got 2 fields, although it's probably a good idea to check your login process. So what I would suggest is that you either you can either follow along or think about what you might test if you're doing this process. So I'm going to have a look at the AbilityNet site and restrict the scope to just our accessibility services section. Let me bring up the page. There's our digital accessibility service section. So in the menu, it's here. We've got all of this content, these subpages underneath it. So this is, for the sake of argument, let's say we've had a look through the AbilityNet website and we've decided that this section contains enough representative pages to give us a good idea about the accessibility of the whole site. In actual fact, that's not the case, because we've got a blog, we've got lots of fact sheets, we've got a whole advice section, and all of those have different layouts and content types. But just for the purposes of demonstrating something manageable today, that's what we're going to restrict it to. So yeah, we've got all of these sub pages, and we've probably had a look through what's underneath this heading, what's within this section, and we will have picked out some representative pages that test the kind of content we want to test for. So we've also got some tools that you may find useful. So the main one I'm going to look at today is Andy. I don't know, Ryan, if you could put the link for that into the chat, that would be really helpful. So this is actually not an extension, it is a bookmarklet. So it sits in your bookmarks bar. Occasionally people have difficulty getting it to work on their website because there's content protection on the website. So if you could also put the what's it called, disable content security policy extension into the chat as well, that'd be helpful. Have a go with Andy on your website. If it just doesn't load at all, then you might need to install that. So I'm just going to bring up Andy. So yeah, I've got it here in my bookmarks bar, and hang on a sec, what I actually wanted to show you was how to install it. Right, here we go. So this is the Andy page, and you've got this pink button here. All you need to do is drag that into your bookmarks bar and you've installed it. That's as simple as it gets. Okay, so yeah, if you want to install that, that's probably a good idea. And I will also be demonstrating this. Okay, so first, some landing page checks. So actually, I'll just bring up Chrome again. Here we go, on our landing page. So we want to start by checking if we've got a skip link. So I'm just going to refresh the page. Take us back to the beginning. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, that's the, if you have difficulty getting Andy to work, then try installing that extension. This is Chrome, by the way. You can use Andy on pretty much any browser, I think. That extension is only for Chrome, but I think there's probably a Firefox one and other things. Anyway, right, so we've refreshed this page. If I start tabbing, we want to see what happens. Okay, so the first thing that happens is that we get this skip to content link. So this is super useful for anybody that needs to use a keyboard to get through a page because they can't use a mouse. So that also includes screen reader users, where their screen reader will read the page out to them. Because otherwise what happens is that you have to navigate through all of the menu items and the search box and all of that sort of thing every time you load a new page in order to get to the main content. So this is why we have the skip to content button. This is easy to test with the tab key. So you just start tabbing and it should appear. It's not always the first element. It could be the second or the third. So it's received focus, as in when we've started tabbing, we can see that it's brought it up, and so we can see it visually, and our keyboard focus has also landed on it. So we also want to make sure that it works. So what should happen is if I press enter now, it should move us down to the main content of the page. So let's try that. Yeah, great. Okay, so that's worked. So we haven't then had to bother going through all of these menu items and so on to get to the main content. A common problem that we find with skip links may be that there is a skip link, but it doesn't take the user to the main content. The next thing that we want to check for is whether there are different ways of getting around the website. So you need to have effectively two different ways to get around a website. So, for example, on this website, we can use all of these menus to move around. We can use the search box. And in fact, we have a third way, which is if you go to the bottom of the page, there is also a sitemap. Let's have a quick look at the sitemap. So the reasoning being for this that for some people, the menu may be difficult to get through and arduous. It's a lot quicker and easier for them just to type something into the search field or to get a quick overview of what's on the site by looking at the sitemap, for example. So yes, you want to test whether you've got more than one way of getting around the website. Let's just bring up the rest of this. So the next thing we want to check for is keyboard access. Can you move through and activate all interactive components? So all of the menus, the buttons, the drop downs, anything like that without a mouse. So that involves using the tab key on the keyboard, potentially the up and down arrows. That might be for things like radio buttons or drop downs. Instead of a mouse. And to activate buttons, links and controls, you want to use space or enter. So if I just bring up, so as I tab through, let's refresh and go to the top again, actually. So as I press the tab key, so we've got the skip to content button, it should take me through all of the interactive elements, so all of the buttons and all of the links and so on. So if I want to search for something, I should be able to press the enter key and that should activate the search. Okay, that has worked. Brilliant. I should be able to get through all of the menus. So I can go through those top level menus, but can I also get through the underneath levels? So I should be able to press either space or enter to expand this and then get through all of those sub menus. The other thing I can potentially do is use the escape key to get out. That's not, it's not necessarily the case that specific keystrokes have to be used, but there are sort of conventions, as it were. But the requirement is that you need to be able to use the keyboard to access everything. So yeah, I can move through all of these items using just the keyboard. This is okay, so that seems to work. We want to make sure, though, that we can get into and out of all components. So there isn't a keyboard trap. So a common keyboard trap might be where you've got a modal that pops up over the screen. So sometimes it can be the case that you can't get into that modal, or once you've got into it, you can't get out of it, for example, or you get stuck in a form field or a social media feed, something like that. You also want to make sure that the focus order is logical, so it doesn't start with a component at the top and then move down to the bottom and then back up to the top. It doesn't need to necessarily be identical to the visual order, but it does need to be logical. And also you want to check really from a usability point of view that the keyboard access isn't inefficient. So again, if you've got things like components that people have to get through before they can get to the content. So say you had a Twitter feed on the left-hand side, and every time somebody, in fact, actually, as an example, we saw this in usability testing the other day, there was a bunch of filters on the left-hand side, and there was no way of collapsing them. So every time you wanted to look at the main content of the page, you had to tab through every single one of those filters and all of the buttons associated with them. And that's just inefficient. It's not necessarily a WCAG failure, but it's not a good user experience. There should be some way of getting past those. Let me just bring up my slides again. Okay. So as an example, another example, we might have something with some accordions. So this is another page from this section where we've got some accordions like this, where it expands a section. So we should be able to use either the space or the enter key to operate those, things like that. Yeah, so one really common problem is with modals and overlays, or perhaps focus just disappears off somewhere and we don't know where it is. So this Coca-Cola, well, no, hang on, this is the UK one. We've got the US one, which is quite interesting. So for example, do we know where focus is all the time? So let's just ignore the cookie notice. Okay, so we can see where focus is. We've got this focus ring. Where is the focus now? I'm not entirely sure. Okay, it was on that carousel element. I'm sure I tested this yesterday and focus kept disappearing off somewhere. And obviously today they fixed it. Okay, now that's working, but it is quite common actually for focus just to sort of disappear off the page and you don't actually know where it is. Or maybe there are components that you can only activate with the mouse. So somebody's made a custom button, for example, but they've only thought about how mouse users could click it and not about how keyboard users could activate it. Sometimes things receive focus twice, perhaps, that kind of thing. So yeah, go through your website with just the keyboard and see what happens. Focus visibility, this is another good question. So yeah, we've just demonstrated this with the Coca-Cola, US Coca-Cola website, which unfortunately defeated my expectations of focus becoming invisible. Actually, I've got another example of this, which is, where is it? This. So we've got this nice focus ring. So the focus ring changes. So for example, on the purple, we've got this white focus ring. And on the yellow, we've got this probably purple, whatever it is, dark colored ring. But you can see where focus is until you get to the submit button. So if I go backwards, so if I hold down the shift key and press tab, I go back. If I press tab again, I go forward. So you might want to make the assumption here that focus is on the submit button, but you can't actually see it. So if I go forwards again, we go to the next interactive element and back again. So it's probably on the submit button, but we can't actually see it. So this is the kind of thing we want to test for. Sometimes there is the default focus indicator, which can be very faint, but that's acceptable. So we want to make sure that there is, but we do want to make sure that there is some kind of focus indicator. And as I've said, it's acceptable for them to receive focus in, for the focus style to be different, but that just does need to be, different for different elements or different parts of the page. But we just need to make sure that there is a focus indicator, basically. There is also in WCAG 2.2, there is also a requirement that focus shouldn't be obscured. So when an element receives focus, it mustn't be completely hidden. So say you've got a cookie banner. Actually, I can show you this with the IKEA website quickly. So yeah, so we've got the cookie notice that's come up. If I carry on tabbing through the page, go through the menus, right, so we start getting to elements where they are completely beneath the cookie banner. So that would be a failure in WCAG 2.2, for example. Yes, so focus visible. When using tab to move through interactive items, can you always see which item has focus? The focus indicator should have sufficient contrast that it is clearly visible. So, for example, on that purple background, it needed to be yellow. On the yellow background, it needed to be purple or black or whatever. It needed to have that difference in contrast to be visible, or it should be the default browser focus indicator. Yes, so I would encourage you to have a quick go at this. either on your own website or pick a random page. Sometimes a sort of mid-level, lower to mid-level shopping website can be quite instructive to have a go at. So move through the interactive elements using the tab key, or hold down the shift key and tab to move backwards. Buttons you can activate with, but you should be able to activate with either the spacebar or the enter key. Links will be the enter key. For radio buttons, you will probably, and drop down lists, you'll be using the up and down arrows. And to zoom in and out, you can use Control+ and Control-. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to have a play with that and see how you get on. Do feel free to put your results into the chat, or for that matter to unmute if you want to talk about anything that you've come up with. Also, actually, just to give a quick demo, we also have this thing called Accessibility Insights for Web, which can be useful. It's this little heart indicator. So this is a browser extension, and it will be, thanks Ryan, it is, all of these links will be also in the slides when you get them. So if we test tab stops, when we start tabbing through the page, it'll show us where focus is going. So I'm now going backwards, and I should be able to see, yes, focus is on the submit button. So if you get lost, that can really help you to work out where focus actually is. But yeah, have a quick go. How's everybody getting on? Have you come up with any issues yet?
Yeah, we have an issue with focus. It goes on and off. You can't quite see.
Oh, really?
That's fine. And then something is not on focus. You hit it again, you can see it's the next element.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we have that happening, and it's on the kind of top nav. So that'd be on like every page of the site.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think we have a bunch of things identified. So we have we finally got money to be able to go back to our developers and be like, we have found a bunch of issues. Please fix. So that was.
It can be quite common sometimes for an interactive element that isn't visible on the page currently in its current state to still be present in the code, for example. So the focus can disappear off somewhere and then come back. You know, say you've got a complex page that has different states.
You know, there's a few things, and there's definitely a modal trap. I can't see the focus when it goes on the X to close out of the modal.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, but I can, like, when the modal opens and I tab through, I can, like, if there's links in it, the links in the modal highlight. But the X to get out of the modal doesn't go on focus. So there's definitely, but I think we've had most of these issues identified. It's just that having the money to go to the developer and be, here's a list of things that we need fixed, that took a while.
Yeah, so it might not be that your X button, that you've got an actual trap. It might appear to be a trap because the X button doesn't have a visible focus.
Yeah,
but you could try pressing enter and see if it closes the modal. But it would be a trap if there was literally no way to get out of that modal and back to the page, for example.
There's I suppose it's when you don't have the disability yourself and you're trying to test things. Like, I always feel like I'm going to miss something because I'm so used to doing things my way that I don't know what tricks or, you know, workarounds people have developed when they do have maybe a visual impairment, or they have a mobility issue, so they're not using, you know, the mouse as much or something. It's like, it's really hard to get out of your own mindset.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, even as an experienced accessibility consultant, the way I do things is not the way that a screen reader user would do them, for example. And they may have very different levels of expertise with their own technology. So say you've been using a screen reader since you started school, you probably know all of those tips and tricks and how to get out of keyboard traps and that sort of thing, if there is a way. But say you only became blind in the last few years and you've just started using one, you might not know all of those things. You know, so obviously the best way to ensure that your product is accessible is to meet the guidelines, and then it should be workable for everybody. But yeah, sometimes in usability testing, and this is a good argument for doing it, you will see that people breeze through things that you might have thought would be huge blockers, but then come massively unstuck at things that you might not have anticipated. So it's always worth doing it.
And we can actually see as well, though, in terms of like our own institution, in terms of accessibility and kind of how forefront it is in our thoughts when we're kind of requesting things or developing things. Any of the newer content types, anything that's more recent, tends to be better in terms of, you know, being navigable by the keyboard and things like that. But anything that's a bit older that we've kind of built off of, that's where it's kind of like we didn't do the kind of maybe best practice back then, which we're starting to do now, or we've been doing for more recently. So there's like this kind of some pages are really good because they're all new content, and some pages that are disastrous because they're all old content. So
well, and I think that can be also a case of maybe it was accessible when the page was first put in,
the rules change,
been added to it. I would say it's like gardening. You know, you can't just relax and stop weeding. You have to keep an eye. Basically.
Oh, completely. Yeah, no, and that's the thing as well. Like in our situation, we have many moderators, so you know, it's not.
You have to make sure they're all trained up to date, and
and it's that thing of you kind of, you start with really good intentions and you're really, you know, adamant and diligent, and then the next time you're doing something, you're this mad pressure in a mad hurry, and you might cut corners, you mightn't put in your alt text, you might forget to format something as a heading and just embolden it, you know, because, or you just copied and pasted from the document you were given, as opposed to tweaking it, you know. And like I say, because we have such a large community of moderators, you know, that consistency, it's harder to like not police but to monitor, because there's so many pages of such a big site. So that's kind of an issue as well. I think if any companies or places have a smaller team of people updating the content, it's kind of easier to keep things kind of to standard,
under control. It's another good argument for doing occasional site scanning. Then you can pick up on those sorts of things. Okay, any other comments that people wanted to bring up before we move on? Everybody breezed through their websites with no keyboard issues at all. Brilliant. Okay, fabulous. Okay. Right, so some more content page checks. Ryan, perhaps you could put the bookmarklets into the group chat, although I think we can use Andy for this as well. So the first thing we want to check is the heading structure. So as I was saying, say you use a screen reader, you can just bring up a list of the headings, or you can just navigate through the headings, and that gives you that equivalent that you might do as a sighted user of just scanning the page to get a sense of what's on it. So you want to make sure that the heading structure, that the headings are properly marked up, so you know they are recognized as headings by a screen reader because they have that semantic markup in the code. And we also want to make sure that the heading structure is logical and effective, that it's the headings also describe the content which they head up, for example. So yeah, there are various ways that you can test this. So as well as the bookmarklets, I mean, there's no point really in going through loads of them. But so if we use Andy, for example, so we're back to our digital accessibility services page. It has a drop down here. If I go to structures, it brings up a list of the headings here. So we can, it literally just pulls out anything that's marked up as a heading within the content. And we can see we've got these different heading levels of H1, H2. I think we've only got H2s. We haven't got H3s and H4s, but we want to make sure that this is as it were, a family tree of headings, so that we start with a top level heading. Usually it's H1, not always. Any subheadings of that, anything that's visually subheadings of that H1 would be marked up as H2. Anything that's visually a subheading of the H2 would be marked up as an H3, etc. So it's like a downwards branching tree, effectively. And we want to make sure that this reflects the visual structure. So we've got this H1 of digital accessibility services, and then we've got this H2 of how we can help or support you. And it's logical that that is a subheading of that top level heading. So we also have the Paul Adams bookmarklets. So these are these other things that we've got in my bookmarklets bar. So there's also a headings one. I'll just X out of Andy. This seems to not be working actually for some reason. There we go. And it'll just put that little mark next to a heading to tell you what level it is. The other thing we need to test for is yes, whether headings describe the content they head. So that's obviously a very manual check. This is something that you just need to make sure that it's sensible. Reflow and magnification. So this is really for people who have low vision and need to zoom into the page to be able to see the content. So we want to check both at 200% and at 400%. So we want to make sure that all of the content and functionality is still available to us. And up to 400%, we also want to make sure, because obviously the page is going to reflow, we want to make sure you don't have to scroll horizontally for miles. And we want to make sure that all of the text and everything resizes. So it's quite common, for example, that some of the text might not resize. So maybe they will have thought about it to an extent, but yeah, they might have forgotten about the text within drop downs, for example. So I'm just going to, so if you want to be absolutely technically correct about this, you need to set your screen size to a particular resolution, which is 1280 times 1024. But this is actually the size of this laptop screen that I'm sharing. So yeah, if I just hold down Control and use the mouse wheel to zoom in up to 200%, I should be able to access everything. So I should still be able to check out everything in the menus, for example, and all of the sub menus. Yeah, so I would want to check, for example, that all of these sub menu items, all the text resizes, none of it's cut off, for example. That can be also quite common. We want to scroll down the page, check that we've still got all of the same content, nothing's reflowing off the page. So this is just at 200%. We can also go up to 400%. So this is, you know, people may have quite severe visual impairment and need to scroll right, zoom right in. So again, we want to make sure that we can access all of these items in the menu, which we can. Just double check that any of the longer bits aren't cut off. Can we get all the way down the page? You know, so we're only really looking at quite a few words in a line at each point. Yeah, and we shouldn't have to scroll, as I say, horizontally across the page at any point. Okay. Page titles. So we also want to think about whether the title of the page is clear. So we can look at that in the browser tab. We want to make sure that when somebody arrives at a page, the title that's communicated to them describes what's actually happening on that page. Preferably it's unique, you know, you haven't got a whole bunch of pages which all have exactly the same title. So if we look at the browser tab here, so this is our, just go back up to the top and de-zoom. Right, so if we look at the browser tab, I'm just hovering over browser tab, it drops down the title of the page, which is Digital Accessibility Services, AbilityNet, and then it's got the URL of the main website. So yeah, that tells us what's on the page. I'm happy with that. We've got the unique information at the front, which is just good practice, really. and then the name of the website afterwards, which obviously is going to be on every page of this website. So yeah, we want to make sure that those titles are adequately descriptive. And further, so navigation, this is another thing we need to think about, whether the navigation is consistent across pages. So for instance, all of those menus that we've looked at, the items within them are in the same order so that people can more easily find things when they're on a different page. They're not having to sort of relearn different conventions every time they go to a different page. So all of this menu structure, when I go to a completely different part of the website, you should still get all of these items in the same order, for example. We also want to check that any icons and labels are consistent across pages. So if we have icons representing a specific function, then those are the same across pages. You might see this quite commonly in mobile apps, for example, a lot of reliance on icons, and you would want to make sure that they were always used to mean the same thing. So say if we've got a magnifying glass icon, does that mean zoom or does it mean search? You know, you want to make sure that it says it means the same thing on every page. Ideally, an icon should have a text label. People commonly don't understand icons very well unless they're super common ones. If they don't have a text label, then they need alternative text in the same way as images do. And this might be shown within Andy. And we want to make sure that all of our images have alternative text, and that the text is a suitable equivalent to the image. Well, I say all of our images, all of our informative images need to have a text alternative. If we've got decorative images, maybe it's just a stock photo of somebody smiling and it doesn't add anything to the meaning of the page, then we want to make sure that it's marked as decorative. So commonly within a content, if you're using a content management system, it's likely that just leaving the alt text field blank will probably achieve that. Let's just look at some alternative text example. So this is part of our digital accessibility services section again. And if we look at, so we've got this graph here, we can test with Andy again, we can test for alternative text. So again, if I go to the drop down, I can select graphics and images, and I can use the arrows to move through them one by one. So it starts with this logo, the AbilityNet logo, and it'll tell us what the alt text is. So in this case, the alt text here is home. And it has this Andy output, which tells you what a screen reader would announce if you were using a screen reader to access that. So I move through, I'm trying to move through each of the, hang on, let's just try refreshing the page again. Okay, it's not recognizing the other images. So I'm going to use the bookmarklet. So this is one of the Paul J. Adams bookmarklets. So if I press this, it should add to the page the alt text. So here it's got the logo, alt equals home. We've got the email icon here. So that has got, you can see it's got alt equals, and then it's just got the inverted commas, but with nothing between them. And that tells us that that image has been marked as decorative. So that's correct, because it's not necessarily adding anything to this link which says sign up for email news. We've got a graph here. So this shows that the alt text that's been given for this is graph showing digital accessibility compliance among different sectors. So this is actually an interesting example, because I'm not sure I would consider that was an equivalent to the image. I don't think that really tells us, it tells us what the graph is, but it doesn't tell us what's on it. So we would want to see more about the content of the graph, either within the text. Yeah, so for example, actually, we've got spelled out here what is actually on the graph. So that is actually, in that case, a suitable text alternative, even though it's not within the alt text. And as a further example, I think there's another one. Here we go. Yes. Alt equals image of students standing in a row using different devices. Did we really need that? Arguably, we could say that that was decorative. It's also got all of this text here, so possibly this text should be also available either within the alt text, probably too long. So maybe then we want that text to appear on the page. So things like this. There is, it can be difficult to work out what kind of alt text an image should have, and there is a decision tree which can help with this. I don't know if you want to put that into the chat, Ryan. So yeah, we want to check that decorative images have got that null alt text, which is empty alt text image. We want to check that the alt text on other images is meaningful as well. So a further thing we want to check is whether the link text makes sense in the context of the page, so in the context of its surrounding text. So if we look for some hyperlinks, let's just have a quick look. Okay, we've got this link here, Public Sector Bodies, Accessibility Regulations 2018. I'm paraphrasing here. I would say that link text makes sense. It tells us what that link is. You know, this tells us what's going to happen when we click on that link. So this is important. We want to make sure that when somebody just arrives on that link. So again, if you're a screen reader user, you can just bring up a list of links, or you can navigate through links, through just the links. And you want to make sure that people, when somebody lands on that, that it tells them what that link is. Maybe they have to arrow backwards and read the entirety of the sentence. That's okay, but they're not going to be left in doubt as to what that link actually does. Yeah, so ideally you also want your links to be unique, so you don't want loads of repetitive things like click here or read more. Not necessarily a failure, but again, not a good user experience. Color contrast. So again, we want to make sure that there's sufficient color contrast between text or meaningful graphics, buttons, that kind of thing, and their background colors. So yeah, as Ryan has correctly detected, we're about to have a look at color contrast analyzer. So if we go back to our page, we might have a question, for instance, about the teal of the top banner and the white of the text. So I've got color contrast analyzer already installed. This is a free tool, and we can check this. So we can either, if we've got access to the code, we can enter the values. If we don't, we can just use the eyedropper tool. So let's pick the white of the text and the teal of the background, and it'll tell us, yeah, okay, we are passing at level AA, both for regular text and for large text. So that's good. An example of something that fails might be, I think it's the British Coca-Cola website. That's the UK one. Coca-Cola Great Britain, Coca-Cola US. Yeah, so if we go through this lovely carousel, I think there was a good one I found earlier. No, maybe it's the UK one, sorry. But you want to make sure that things like this text pass contrast with the image that is their background, for example. Where was it? Yeah, so here it's kind of fading out against the background. That's not really okay. You want to be able to read all of the text. This is a really good example. Here it completely, certainly at this reflow point, this white text completely disappears because you've got this big streak of white that goes across the page. You've also got all of these colors here. You need to make sure that the text passes contrast with the background at every point. So actually, let's try, if we make this smaller, does it move? It might do. It does move. So you might not always pick that up. So you need to be a bit careful about that. Okay, right. The other thing is that automated testing tools, so Andy might not pick that up, or Wave or Axe, any of the other automated testing tools, because it's not going to be able to measure that white, those different colors. It might think that it's just a black background. So it's preferable to use a color contrast analyzer. Actually, if we look at Andy, let's just check. Color contrast. Okay, well, it's just given us color contrast alerts. That's useful to look at. You know, it can tell us where we might want to investigate further. Yeah, you see, it's saying that this passes because it's not. Is it? Yeah, no, it thinks it's this. It thinks it's the background is grey anyway, which clearly it's not. So yeah, you need to sort of visually check things as well. So I guess anything like buttons, icons, as well as text, that kind of thing. Yeah, and the contrast ratio required for text is 4.5 to 1. For large text and user interface elements, it's 3 to 1. We also want to double check that color isn't the only means of conveying meaning. So for example, I have got a form somewhere. We've got this on a different part of our website, actually. It's a form basically with 2 radio buttons. If I complete it, submit it without completing any of the information, all that happens is that these radio buttons turn red. So we would fail this page on that, because that isn't actually telling us what the error is or anything. If I don't have good color vision, maybe I'm colorblind, which is I think more common than a lot of people think, I'm not going to be able to tell that there's an error on that page. So we need to make sure that, and also in text, you know, it might say, press the red button, but maybe I can't perceive that that button is red. So yeah, that's another thing that we want to check for. Form page, form field. So forms often provide a fertile area for accessibility issues. So we want to make sure that form fields have labels that are associated with the input field. So a really quick way to check this is just to click on the label, or you can use Andy or Wave. So for example, I should have a form somewhere. So yeah, I've got a form here. Let me just refresh this. So if I click on this label, your name, then the cursor has been moved into the input field. So we know that that label and that field are properly associated. And I can go down, do the same thing with all of these fields. What that means is that for a screen reader user, when they land in that field, they will hear the label. So they will know what that field is. So that's a really simple way to check this. We can also check it with Andy. Hopefully. That we go through, yeah, I think through the focusable elements. Yeah, so it's showing us that the output for that input field is your telephone number. So it's showing us that that label is correctly associated. We also want to make sure that required fields are identified. So let's have a look back at this form again. Yeah, so they've got the required fields are marked with an asterisk, and that asterisk is also explained. So I feel pretty confident that we have said that any fields that are required are clearly indicated. And we also need to make sure, as we did before, that forms are completely keyboard accessible. You should be able to tab through all of the input fields and complete the whole form without touching the mouse at all. So all of those text fields, the checkboxes, the radio buttons. Let's just quickly go through. So I can tab through all of these fields. I can get into, so this is with the tab key, I can get into this drop down if I use the space bar or the enter key, and now the arrow keys, I should be able to move through all of these and select one. With the radio buttons, I should be able to move, this is the up arrow key and the down arrow key, should be able to move through these and select them. I think that's all I need to worry about. Yes, again, just the arrow keys. I should be able to use the arrow keys to get through everything. Should be able to use the keyboard to get through the entire form, basically. And we also need to be sure that we can see where focus is. You know, you need to know what form field you're on if you're going to complete a form successfully. Error messages. So when you get error messages, you want to make sure, well, for a start, you want to make sure that there are error messages, that they're not only indicated by the color of the field, for example, you know, like we saw with those radio boxes. We want to actually be told what the error is and preferably how we can correct it. So we want them to be informative, we want them to be helpful. And we also want the error messages to be associated with the form field, so that if a screen reader user lands on that form field, they know that it's in an error state. You know, they can read that error message. So let's just double check this. So we haven't really filled in any of these. I'll just refresh this actually. So we haven't filled any of this form in at all, and I'm just going to submit the form. Yeah, so we've got these informative, helpful error messages. This has told us why this field has thrown an error. That's because it's mandatory, and it's also told us how we can correct the error. So please enter your name. We also need to make sure that the error message is associated with the form field. So again, we're going to go through Andy. So I'm just working my way through. Yeah, so what you should see is an ARIA described by attribute. So that means that this input field is described by the error message. And again, you have the Andy output, which says this field is mandatory, please enter your name. So we know it's working. We know that that error message is correctly associated with the input field. I think that's pretty much it for forms. So multimedia, so things like videos, they have captions, that they've got audio descriptions, and that they've got transcripts. So that's not, it's not sufficient for a video to just have a transcript at level AA, but it does meet at level A. There may be some exceptions for some of this stuff within the specific Irish legislation. I think sometimes there are exemptions around video of a certain age. Anyway, but I will not comment on that as I don't know. So if we have a look at a page with some video on it, we want to play a bit of it and check whether it's got some captions.
Oh my God, is that the airport is being announced?
Okay, so this is a YouTube video and it's got optional captions, so we need to turn those on.
I'm a digital accessibility consultant. As I'm blind, I can't see my phone screen. I'm going to be looking at some airline apps.
Okay, so we can see it has got captions available, and ideally you want to check all the way through that video, and for a full audit you would need to make sure that the captions were complete. And that they were accurate, that they weren't just automatically generated ones that didn't really make sense half the time. But if you're just doing quick checks like this, then you can just check the first 30 seconds or so. We also want to check that if the video isn't comprehensible, well, if we've got, we also want to check any audio description. If the video isn't comprehensible without audio description, we want to check that that contains all of the important information. If it's just a talking heads video, then you can just make sure that the people participating in that narrate any important text content, or perhaps there's a voiceover narrating any important text content. There are quite complex requirements around multimedia, but you can check what's needed on the W3C website, and that's what the link on this slide is. We also need to make sure that video can be paused or stopped if it auto plays, and we need to make sure that audio can be muted, particularly if it moves or auto plays for more than 5 seconds. So as an example, We looked at the city website earlier. I'll just refresh this page. So it has this auto playing video, which I have a balance disorder. This makes me feel quite nauseous. So I'm going to pause it, but I can pause it. And it's precisely for people like me that this, and also people with migraines and so on, it's precisely for people like me that we need to be able to pause it. You may also see commonly other pages where this isn't the case. So we've got the Bowden website here. We've got this auto playing video. Absolutely no way to turn that off. So the ability to pause or stop movement also applies to things like carousels and animations. So I think one of the Coca-Cola websites, the carousel just auto plays and there isn't a way to stop it. So yeah, you need to make sure that there is a button or something with which that can be stopped. We also, if there's any automatically playing audio for more than 3 seconds, it should be possible to pause or stop that, or alter the volume independently of the device audio control. So it needs something like a mute button. And flashing content, we need to make sure that there is no content that flashes more than 3 times per second, because it can trigger seizures in some people. Okay, so nearly there. Just a few more points to get through. Should I check with a screen reader? So yes, absolutely. It's a really good idea if you've got the time, the bandwidth to do so, to get familiar with a screen reader. So some of them are free. NVDA is a desktop one, it's open source. We commonly recommend people use that because it means that also you can ask your developer to have a go with NVDA and replicate any problems that you've found. Also VoiceOver if you've got an iPhone, or TalkBack if you've got an Android phone. These are free. It's well worth having a play around. But it's also a good idea to get familiar with it, maybe to have a little bit of training around it, to get a better sense of how people use them. Mostly the navigation is the same as keyboard navigation, so you're using the tab key and so on to get around. There are some generic shortcut keys, so things like H. If you press H, it'll generally jump you to the next heading, or you can press Shift H to go back to the previous heading. It's useful to know that you can just press the control key at any time to pause the speech, because it can be quite irritating if it's sort of jabbering on. And there is usually also a screen reader modifier key, so it'll be something like the caps lock key, where any key you press after that will act as a specific command within your screen reader. So yeah, there's a learning curve around this stuff, but it's really good to have a go with it. And another thing, should I test with disabled users? So as we've discussed before, it does really give you a deeper understanding of those kind of accessibility issues from the user's perspective, and gives you a much better sense of how these things work out in reality. How usable your website is in reality for disabled users. And it also really complements a WCAG audit, gives you a much more comprehensive accessibility evaluation of your website. Before you start, we sometimes say that you should fix basic issues first, as otherwise participants may just not be able to get very far. Certainly, if you've got an existing website and you've had an audit, you need to make sure that you've got through the majority of the issues on your audit, because otherwise your participants are just going to find the issues that you already know about. They may encounter barriers that stop them actually completing the tasks you've given them and so on. But also, if you are starting web projects from scratch, you certainly don't want to leave any testing with disabled users right to the end. You want to make sure that you've considered them when you're doing any user research. But yes, for instance, there are technical requirements for things like screen readers, where it may be those at the end, when you've got a much more fully developed project. But there again, this is something that is changing at the moment. So for example, we've seen that a lot of design tools now have accessible features where you can test prototypes with screen reader users and so on. Yeah, so there's something to consider there about when you test and with which kind of users, and what you expect to gain. So ideally, you also want to think about finding representative users across a range of disabilities, covering the core groups of visual, hearing, mobility, cognitive and learning disabilities. So you might think that you would get the same kind of feedback from two visually impaired people, but one might be primarily a screen reader user, one might be primarily a magnification user. Their feedback is going to be completely different. And you probably want to find testers with a mixture of knowledge from expert to novice, using a representative range of assistive technology. Also super helpful with the hearts and minds issue. So if you're having trouble with getting your developers or your stakeholders or anybody in the process, if they're not very convinced about accessibility, it can be really convincing to see users struggling with your website. So any questions? I'm very happy to, we're nearly at time, but I'm very happy to hang on for a bit if people do want to have a chat, ask any questions, do fire away. Feel free to unmute or just to ask questions in the chat. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming, everybody, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thanks so much, Jess. Have a good day.
Cheers, folks.
Thanks a million. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a million. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. That was very informative, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.